Um, okay, so before I get into this one, we've had breaking news in the last hour of an attack in Utrecht, which is the fourth city of the Netherlands. I've been there. It's a busy railway hub, big train station there. The news is that a man went on a rampage. He's of Turkish descent, and three people are dead. I believe it was a gun attack. Three people are dead, and numerous others are injured. And the authorities are describing it as a terrorist incident. Now, whether this is a direct response to what happened in New Zealand or whether it's a coincidence, I think the latter is unlikely. I think it probably is a direct response. Um, I'll probably comment more on that later when more details emerge. But the danger here and the tragedy is this really is going to become normalized in Europe, much like the spree shootings in America happening every few weeks. These terror attacks in Europe are going to become so normalized that only the very worst ones will get attention. I mean, this has got attention, obviously, but it's not the headlines. The Brexit stuff is the headlines. And, there would have been a point where that would have been the headline. Now, I'm not saying that Brexit isn't important. Of course it is. But I think it's just an indicator that this is becoming normalized in Europe. But anyway, to get to the main point of the video, which is directly connected to this anyway, since the New Zealand attack, there's been a lot of focus on that, understandably. And like I said in my video about terrorism, it it's actually the worst terrorist attack anywhere in the world this month, including in war zones. So it's right that it's getting a lot of attention. It's also the worst far right attack since the Norway attacks of 2011 anywhere in the world. Although there has been others since then. The other day when I was mentioning major far right incidents, I'd overlooked the Pittsburgh synagogue attack last year, which was pretty serious, 11 people killed, and there's been others. So it's understandable that there's attention on this, particularly in a small country like New Zealand. New Zealand's a popular country around the world. It's got very few enemies, and so understandably, there's been a lot of international sympathy for the people of New Zealand at this difficult time. Um, what I want to talk about, though, is a lot of the dialogue that's going on, or rather, a lot of the narrative, because I'm not sure if it can be called dialogue. What happened in New Zealand, another reason it got a lot of attention, and this is why generally, actually, terrorist attacks in multicultural, diverse countries do get attention, is because often the victims are from different backgrounds by nature. Therefore, this has reverberations as far away as Karachi, Dhaka, um, and so when a terrorist attack occurs in a country like New Zealand or Canada or the UK, the reverberation is felt around the world um, in a way that wouldn't necessarily be the case with, say, a suicide bombing in Somalia or Afghanistan, because people are fleeing those countries and not settling in those countries. But that brings me to the point about, frankly, some of the hypocrisy in the some of the narrative that we've been hearing. Firstly, there's outright lies being spun by Islamists that it hasn't been called a terrorist attack. It has. That needs to be repeated over and over again because they're trying to imply, oh well, look, this is just evidence the West doesn't care about Muslim victims, even though every network has covered it, every reasonable person has condemned it. The whole of New Zealand is changing its policies on this. Apparently, they're going to change gun laws in the wake of this. Um, so to suggest that it's not being taken seriously is beyond absurd. Um, there are some right wingers who will claim it's getting too much attention. I don't agree with that. I think it's a major terrorist incident, does deserve attention. Um, but here's the thing: we talk about this was a hate crime against Muslims, and it very clearly was. The gunman had that in mind, and his manifesto had all sorts of rants with very specific references against Muslims. He was referencing other far right attackers and so on. I don't need to go through all that again. It's been well documented. Um, But there is hypocrisy here because do we see the same level of outrage from some Muslim commentators who are saying, oh, this shows Muslims are under attack in the West, as when we see not only the persecution of minorities, but sectarian infighting within Islam, which causes oceans of blood every single year. And I'm not just talking about the Shia Sunni schism, I'm talking about persecution of minority branches of Islam, for example, the Sufis and the Ahmadis. One of the worst attacks in Pakistan in recent years was on a Sufi mosque. Dozens were slaughtered in that attack. I forget which year it was, but because there's been so many attacks in Pakistan, the Ahmadi community has been consistently under attack there. So when Muslims talk about supposed persecution in Western countries, they need to look at what is happening in Islamic countries, the sectional infighting, because frankly, there is a lot of hypocrisy there. And there is one school of thought that says, oh, it's all down to Western policy. The West seeks to divide and conquer. And if the West didn't get involved in military interventions, then none of this would happen. I don't buy that. Or put it this way, if that is down to Western intervention, what does that say about Muslims? It's a very patronizing, um, it's a very bleak overview of Muslims that they're almost like children, i.e., the West is intervening, so that just stokes up these tensions. In other words, oh, if the awful West didn't do it, then we'd all be friends. Really? I think what's happening in Islam, and this is the great elephant in the room, what's really happening is something akin to what Christianity went through in the 16th century. There is a bloody, chaotic sectarian war going on. Yes, mainly between Shia and Sunni, but between, frankly, every branch of Islam. So when Islamists talk about spreading the caliphate, they don't have all Muslims in mind. This is the ironic thing. They want to spread a global Islamic caliphate, but they won't even recognize all Muslims as Muslims. I have Muslim friends who are reformists. They've been branded non Muslim simply because they recognize that there need to be changes within. That's the sort of mentality we're dealing with. Um, so, in terms of victimhood in Western countries, obviously, as this attack shows, there has been violence against Muslims and there has been hate crimes. And it isn't just what happened in New Zealand, there have been examples of individual hate crimes, like the elderly gentleman I spoke about in Birmingham who was viciously murdered by uh, a young neo Nazi thug of Ukrainian descent here in Birmingham 6 years ago. An incident, incidentally, that didn't get that much attention. In my view, it should have got more. It didn't get anywhere near as much coverage as the Rigby case. But anyway, there has been obviously hate crimes against individual Muslims. Now, the Canadian government tried to introduce a controversial bill making specific hate crime legislation against Muslims a criminal offence. I don't think that was necessary. I think it should have just been covered in general hate crimes. The problem with making it a criminal offence to target Muslims is there's a very blurred line then between, well, someone could interpret criticism of Islam as being a hate crime. If someone who's obviously a Muslim, let's say a Muslim woman who's wearing a hijab is physically attacked, and we have to be careful with those allegations because some of them have been proven to be plain false, and people have come forward and admitted that they lied about it. So we have to treat each reported case with some caution. But when incidents like that do happen, then obviously that's awful, and it's the thugs responsible need to be arrested and charged without question. But the problem is if you start introducing legislation that is against, making it a criminal offense to be anti-Islam, what does that even mean? I mean, criticizing hardcore Islamic dogma, for example, Sharia doctrine, that can be perceived as anti-Islam. But I think most reasonable people would acknowledge that's hardly in the same category as physically attacking or vocally abusing someone who happens to be Muslim, which should be a criminal offence because it's harassment, it's abuse, it's bullying, it's horrible. No one should be targeted because of what they look like or what faith they adhere to. That's plain wrong, and I'm never going to make excuses for that sort of behaviour. But I think it's very important that the wording of legislation, I mean, that bill in Canada was very controversial because many people interpreted it as basically a blasphemy law and everything but name. Um, and that should be, treated with. It came after the Quebec City mosque attack, but I don't think there was a need for the Canadian government to bring in new legislation on top of what was already there, and that's why it was controversial. Um, So, in terms of the narrative that Muslims are victims in the West, that is preposterous. I accept that, for example, Muslims living in New Zealand are going to feel nervous. I accept that individual Muslims who've been the victim of hate crime are going to feel nervous. But is there a collective agenda against Muslims in the West? Absolutely not. Even in the war on terror, whatever you think of the politics of that, George Bush was very careful to say this is not a war on Islam. And Islamists are the ones stoking that narrative that the West has a war on Islam. People will say, oh, well, the West doesn't help when it invades Muslim lands. But what about the brutality that Muslim lands inflict on not only their own populations, but other Muslim lands? Where's the Ummah there? Where was the Ummah when Saddam invaded Kuwait? People conveniently forget that when assessing the legacy of Bush Sr. That's the leader of an Islamic country. And okay, Saddam wasn't particularly religious, but it just goes to show that you can't just dismiss it as, oh, it's all down to the West. Look at Saudi Arabia, what it's doing in Yemen right now. Where's the Ummah in there? Look at, and yeah, that's from British weapons. We have blood on our hands with that. But the point I'm making here is that when it suits them, Islamists will talk about Islamic unity and talk about coming together and standing up to the infidels and the degenerate West, which persecutes Muslims. And yet, how many Muslims actually flee from democratic secular democracies to Muslim countries? If the West is so awful, how many Muslims actually, say, of Somali or Afghan descent, actually want to go back to those hellholes? They don't, because the situations are so chronically bad. And you can't just dismiss it all on Western policy. Why is it the majority of conflicts in the world today do have Islam at or near the core of the problem? I'm not saying all of them. The Mexican drug war doesn't, and some of the wars in sub-Saharan Africa don't, like the wars in Congo. But most of the other conflicts in the world today have Islam, at least to some extent, at their core. So that's not a coincidence. I think it's been partly because of the spread of pan Islamism in the world, largely because of that. But there's been many other factors as well. You could argue that that's also a side product of it, because Islamists take advantage of unstable situations. That's why they moved into Iraq and Syria. That's why ISIS took advantage of those situations. It wasn't the West that created ISIS, it was the situations that created ISIS. Situations that, in the case of Syria, began with the brutal response of Bashar Assad to legitimate protests. ISIS took advantage of that quagmire. And the great distortion of this decade is that the West created ISIS. That is the conspiracy theory that you see all over the internet. And yet, I've yet to see anyone give solid evidence that, as a matter of policy, the West created ISIS. This is a very dangerous claim because it leads then into conspiracy theories, some of them anti Semitic. That one of them, for example, is why does ISIS never attack Israel? Well, Israel has some of the best security in the region. They have to. So there are some very dangerous and plain false conspiracy theories being thrown around out there by Islamist sources, and they need to be robustly combated because all it's doing is stoking up a Leninist narrative. It's turning um, Muslims against non-Muslims, and it's galvanizing far right activists in secular democracies because then they can say all the Muslims are a problem. So it's a vicious cycle. I will say this though: whenever there are Islamist attacks, the general Muslim response, condemnation is not enough. It's not. There has to be an acknowledgement of the nature of this problem. You know, if you demand that white people recognize white neo Nazi extremism, and you might not blame white people for that, but if you are saying you need to recognize it, then you as Muslims need to recognize that Islamism is a real thing. I have very little patience or respect for this argument. Oh, it's got nothing to do with Islam. I mean, the young guy that attacked the Australian senator, I think the response to that was heavy-handed. That he put a tweet or something on on his wall. I don't know if it was Instagram or whatever, but he said terrorism has no religion. That's something that's been used a lot by people on the left. It's not true. Yeah, terrorism doesn't have a religion in the sense that there are different kinds of terrorist groups, but every Islamist group is Islamic because they're pushing extreme interpretations of Islamic law, of um, politicization of Islam. So to say that Islamic extremism, which is what it is, has nothing to do with Islam is just a lie. It's just a cowardly lie. And we're not going to get to the root. It's a bit like saying, oh, white supremacist extremism has nothing to do with white identity politics, when it clearly does. It's very distorted and it's very extreme, but you know, I cannot say that Brenton Tarrant isn't a white man because he is. And I, as a white man, recognize we need to be honest about the likes of him. Um, so Muslims cannot say every time that an Islamic extremist commits acts of terror, like what's happened today in Utrecht, you know, this argument of it's got nothing to do with Islam, it's used by Islamists, but it's also used by frankly moral cards on the regressive left who just want the virtue signal because they think it would somehow be Islamophobic to call a spade, to say that Islamic extremism is part of Islam. And yes, the Westboro Baptist Church is part of Christianity. They may be an extreme fringe example, but if someone self identifies, it doesn't mean that they have ownership. It doesn't mean that they alone get to define what that is. But if someone is latching on to or feeling the need to identify themselves with a religion or with an ideology, then something in that religion or ideology has attracted them. You know, I could get really philosophical about this. But, you know, in the case of Islamic extremism, we're not talking about a few unhinged nuts. We are talking not only about major terrorist organizations active in many countries, we are talking about societal attitudes. So when thousands of Pakistanis demand the blood of one woman, that's pure Islamism. It's not Islamist terrorism in the sense that it isn't suicide bombing. I've heard Pakistanis say that they're dead against terrorism and the Taliban has nothing to do with Islam. But you ask the same people, do you support the death penalty for blasphemers? They would absolutely say yes. So Islamism isn't just about terrorism; it's about a mentality, and this is what people need to understand when they claim that, oh, you can't criticize Islam. You know, if you do, then you're a Islamophobe. I don't use the term myself. I say anti-Muslim bigotry, and my understanding of that is purely hating all Muslims and generalizing all Muslims. But pointing out the fact that there is extremism within Islam is not Islamophobic. It just isn't. In a way, phobia determines fear, irrational fear. And incidentally, one of the first people to use the term was none other than Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran as a charge against women who wouldn't conform to the headscarf. Think about that. So I am tired of the hypocrisy from some Muslims. I am tired of this idea that the West has to grovel and apologize to the Islamic world. No. And put it this way, if you want to put it down to foreign policy, how does that explain the fact that countries that had nothing to do with the war on terror were also targeted by Islamic extremists? So this narrative is false. Final point is, if it wasn't obvious, the 19 hijackers who attacked the World Trade Center, they attacked America first. America did not attack them first.